Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all. This is Canada's most irreverent talk show, the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. Although I have to say, I often revel in being an independent media voice, not necessarily part of the mainstream media. In fact, let's be real, we criticize legacy media outlets a fair bit on this show and at True North. There was a great, I should have given Sean a graphic to put up there, but there was a piece in the Hill Times today, the headline, "The Mainstreamification of Andrew Lawton." This was just so delightful. I've gone mainstream now. Don't hold it against me too much. This was an interview I did with Chelsea Nash, who's a very convivial journalist that we sat down with over lunch. I say we, it was just me and a photographer for the Hill Times a couple of weeks back in Ottawa. She calls me disarmingly friendly, which I think is a great compliment. And there was also another term there. Lawton, who is jovial and friendly no matter the subject, asserted he is outside the mainstream media. So I will take jovial and friendly no matter the subject. I will take disarmingly friendly. It was a lot of fun, and I'm so glad. If you're a Hill Times subscriber, you can check that out in today's edition. I'm getting old, by the way. On Friday, I went to the gym. I know, breaking news, right? And I, strained my hamstrings just a little bit. And then I was fine. And then Sunday, I stood up too quickly or something, or stood up in the wrong way. And now it's pained me to walk since then. So I'm, if you see me wincing at some point, it's because I leaned too much on the hamstring and now I'm re-traumatizing myself. But regardless, great to have you tuned into the show. We'll talk about more serious matters than my hamstrings and my disarmingly jovial nature, because the Liberal government has been in no way interested in being transparent about the possibility of foreign interference that is infiltrating Canadian democracy. You had Elizabeth May come out basically and say, no big deal, everything's fine, she's not worried, after reading the unredacted report of the Parliamentary National Security Committee. Then you had Jagmeet Singh come out and say, he has some grave concerns about this. And now Justin Trudeau has come out and basically said nothing. He started to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the report. He says he has issues and concerns with how they've gone about it. And more crucially, as you see here, not interested in opening up about whether there are any Liberal members of Parliament implicated. Take a look.
Are there currently any MPs in your caucus that are named in the NSICOP report to be wittingly or semi-wittingly participants in foreign interference?
The issue of foreign interference is one that this government has taken incredibly seriously since 2015. We brought in the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians over the objections of the Conservative Party and indeed the strenuous resistance of the Harper government for years. We brought in a renewed NSIRA for oversight over our national security instances, and we created specific bodies of experts, of top civil servants to ensure the integrity of our elections. We've also called a number of different reports, including an ongoing report on foreign interference that we're working with right now to see how they can follow up on the NSICOP report.
We've heard from Mr. Singh and Ms. May. They have both said that there are no members of their party who are named in the report. So I'll ask you again, are there any current Liberal caucus members named in the NSICOP report that are wittingly or semi-wittingly participants in foreign interference?
I will allow Mr. Singh and Ms. May to speak for themselves.
That was two attempts at asking him, are there liberal members of Parliament implicated? Two very artful, no, not really artful dodges of that. The second one, they've said they're a member, blah, blah, blah. Are there members of yours? I'll let them speak for themselves. But that Prime Minister, that wasn't actually the question. Now, as it stands, there are some doubts about how this information, or if this information could even be legally disclosed. And some of this goes back to a case that predates this particular report that I wanted to bring attention to now. Ryan Alford is a professor in the Lakehead University Faculty of Law and joins us now. Ryan, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show today.
My pleasure, Andrew. Glad to join the mainstream.
Thank you very much, sir. You were raised, you saw something wrong about how this committee was structured before this report came about. Explain for people that didn't follow this why that was and what's happened up until this point.
On your clip, you hear Justin Trudeau claiming credit for establishing NSICOP. Two things bear mentioning. One, it's not a proper parliamentary committee. It doesn't have the powers of a parliamentary committee. It's technically an advisory committee to the Prime Minister. So it reports to him, its chair is chosen by him, and he retains the power to redact its reports. So they can't publish or indeed table anything in Parliament without the prior approval and redactions of the Prime Minister. The other problematic element is that its members are stripped of parliamentary privilege. So you saw when its chair, David McGuinty, spoke in a press conference, he said, we had to accept that we don't have parliamentary privilege because we serve on this committee and we're made privy to these confidential documents, which, by the way, Parliament has a right to see anyway. But now, when the Prime Minister is claiming, well, I have issues with the way that they created this report, not only are they gagged, but their hands are tied.
And one thing that I'll note here, and this may get into the weeds for how a lot of Canadians view the institutions of government in Canada, but it's very relevant, is that a prime minister is not meant to be the guy in charge of Parliament. A prime minister can be fired by Parliament. He has to have the confidence of Parliament. And that's where, even if in a majority Parliament, it looks like the prime minister may have this, autocratic power, the reality is there is a check and balance there. Now, in this case, we have a minority Parliament, but even if all of the other parties were to gang up, if you will, NSICOP still would be subject to Justin Trudeau, you're saying.
Exactly right. And that's the problem. So in 2005 and years afterwards, there were issues with the production of documents to Parliament. And there was a finding of contempt of the Parliament by the Government of Canada, which was very serious. But no one ever doubted that Parliament has the right to these documents. If they say we want to see this, they have the right to see it. It's their call because they are the people who hold the government accountable. That's called responsible government. So creating a system where the only people who have actually seen these documents are subject to 14 years in prison if they reveal in Parliament what they are otherwise entitled to say and discuss, we've got a severe constitutional crisis.
Even among the most liberally minded when it comes to access to information, there's always an understanding that things to do with national security are in a separate category. I mean, so let me ask you, why should this be any different? Why should you be able to do an end run around national security just because of parliamentary privilege?
To begin, it's the Prime Minister's assertion of national security. And you can see the problem with that when we look at the Wuhan lab documents. So it took years, and finally there was a special committee struck, and counsel to it were two former Supreme Court of Canada justices. And the conclusion was that the reason for withholding the documents wasn't national security. It was because they were potentially embarrassing to the government. So when documents are withheld on the basis of national security, it's not really clear that they're being withheld because they are dangerous to national security. And the question is, who gets to make the call there? Is it the Prime Minister who stands to lose in this situation when we see that he's been involved in obfuscation and that he's used this pretext of national security to avoid political embarrassment? Or is it Parliament? Because the notion here is that Parliament has procedures. The gagging provisions of the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians Act apply even if a parliamentary committee was to hold an in-camera meeting, which is to say, if the chair of a parliamentary committee, like the House of Commons Public Safety and National Security Committee, says, we want to hold a meeting under conditions of confidentiality, no one may talk about what's going on in the committee, and there, a member of this committee spoke about what they saw in NSICOP, they would still be subject to criminal prosecution. Here we see that given that Parliament has its own measures to protect confidentiality, that the measures in NSICOP are more about maintaining the control of the executive, namely the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and as you know, with the Winnipeg lab case and other ones, there have been a number of examples where this government has taken a very selective view of privilege and confidence. I go back to the Public Order Emergency Commission, where they said, oh, we don't believe in secrets. We're waiving cabinet confidence. We're waiving cabinet privilege. You can see everything. Oh, but we aren't waiving solicitor-client privilege because we don't want you to see that document there. So there is this selective nature, which makes you wonder, and not even really wonder all that hard about, okay, are they picking and choosing based on where they know things are likely to blow up in their face?
That's the most pertinent example you could have given, because what we had there was the whole purpose of the inquiry, the Rouleau Commission, as it was called, to determine whether or not the invocation of the Emergencies Act was lawful, was stymied because the document that presented the legal case, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General's legal analysis for why this was in fact warranted, which was presented to the cabinet and was the sole basis for their decision, was withheld from the public inquiry. That was absolutely scandalous. If we had a less supine media, people would have seen this as obviously a cover-up. The point of the inquiry is purposeless at this stage. But the level of manipulation there really should give people pause.
So you, as I said, were on to this even before we knew this particular issue was going to come up here. You brought a lawsuit that ultimately went against you at the Court of Appeal for Ontario, which found that no parliamentary immunity should not protect you if you're a member of parliament, or I guess theoretically a senator that divulges this. You said you want to take this to the Supreme Court, but explain where their rationale was at the Court of Appeal.
Right. So the Court of Appeal rejected the conclusions of the Superior Court. The Superior Court said you can't take away parliamentary privilege from members of parliament because it's constitutional in nature. And there's a lot of Supreme Court cases that speak to that very point. The most important one, New Brunswick Broadcasting, it states that parliamentary privilege must be absolute if it's to be effective. So here they've said, okay, well, with ordinary legislation, we've taken away this constitutional right of members of parliament. The point of my suit was to say this can't be done other than via constitutional amendment. The problem with the bill, as it was introduced in Parliament in 2017, over the objections of the Conservative Party at the time, was that members of Parliament didn't understand that they were amending the Constitution of Canada. They didn't understand that their right to speak freely in Parliament had constitutional status. And the reason why it has constitutional status is because it doesn't belong just to them. It belongs to the people of Canada, who have the right to elect representatives who can actually perform government oversight effectively.
Yeah, and that was, I think, a very important point. And do you believe that the government knew it was doing an end run around the Constitution, or do you believe they just didn't even really consider that?
They should have known better. I think the position that they took, and this was based on parliamentary law officers coming in and testifying before parliamentary committees, is that, no, it isn't amending the Constitution. There's a way for us to do this because it's only a minor abridgment, right? But the problem is they didn't bring in legal experts who could have pointed to the significance of those Supreme Court cases. And I implored them to do it. And you can go back and look at my testimony before the Senate committee, which was considering this in 2017. I said there are legal academics that might disagree with me, but you should hear from them. You should try to get to the bottom of whether or not the Supreme Court would view this as constitutional or not before you pass it. And they didn't do so because they wanted this legislation that badly.
So if we look at the way forward here, as it stands, if a member of parliament were to decide this really needs to be in the public interest, they could, go out and read from the unredacted report, but face jail time for doing so. And, perhaps there might be some renegade that wants to do a come and get me over this. But your view is that there's a way to really keep the spirit of parliament alive here and make that supremacy of parliamentary privilege apply to NSICOP.
Absolutely right. I mean, what I achieved in 2022 in the Superior Court was for that particular provision of the NSICOP Act to be struck out. So the committee could still function, it could still perform all the valuable services that it's been doing. But if the Prime Minister redacts the documents and then lies about what's in the unredacted document, they would have the power to correct him on the floor of the House of Commons. I think that's just basic governmental oversight. That's what I achieved in Superior Court in 2022. But then the government of Canada decided to appeal against that judgment.
Yeah, and we mentioned, obviously you're dealing with the legal arguments here, but you have to not view the politics of this in isolation, because this is exactly what's happening. We have three different leaders who have professed to have read this document, giving three wildly different interpretations of what went into that document and what is in the document itself. And, everyone criticizes Pierre Poilievre for not wanting to accept the briefing on this, but if he does, he's then, going to come out and say his own thing. And realistically, no one in this country can decide who's right.
Well, Tom Mulcair put it quite succinctly. That's a trap. Why would you go in there, read these documents, submit yourself to the undertaking that you not talk about it, and then think that you could do something about it afterwards? Very interestingly, when Elizabeth May was, let's say, rather candid about what she saw, or at least made strong representations about what she saw, it tended to support the political position of the Prime Minister of Canada. Do we really think that in that situation, the decision would be made to prosecute that person? And then we have to think about what would happen in the opposite political scenario. When someone said, the Prime Minister has been obfuscating. I've seen those names, and they include Liberal members of Parliament. I think in that situation, you have to imagine that perhaps prosecution might be on the table.
Well, it's a fascinating one. Any idea on the timeline of getting this to the Supreme Court?
Well, the millstones of justice grind very slowly. I'm filing this week. The government files their response in about a month. I think by December, we'll hear if the Supreme Court wants to take this case. If they do, the hearings will be in spring of next year, decision potentially before the election.
All right. Well, appreciate that very much. Professor Ryan Alford, always appreciate your insights. Thank you for coming on.
Always my pleasure, Andrew.
All right, good to see you. I think I last saw Ryan in the London, Ontario airport. He had been at a little conference down in London. Always great to chat with him. We will definitely follow this, but I want to just make a point on this because online there still is this conspiracy theory about Pierre Poilievre and the security clearance and all of that. Ian Brody, who is the former chief of staff to Stephen Harper, he's also a PhD holding I think he's still a University of Calgary professor. Yes, Ian Brody has talked about this. He said, Poilievre is a member of the Privy Council. He's a member of His Majesty's Privy Council. He has, by all accounts, the ability to read whatever materials the government wants to put in front of him. But he has chosen, because the government has put this ridiculous threshold in place. As Ryan Alford was saying there, they have to accept a gag and read this. And just imagine what would happen if Poilievre were to read this report and in the report sees there is a Liberal member of Parliament shilling for China, say. He cannot go in question period and say, Prime Minister, why are you not kicking blank out of caucus? He can't do it. He can't, he could work around it and maybe risk having the hammer crack down on him, but he could not go to the House of Commons, even on the floor of the House of Commons, and say whatever it is that he needs to hold the government to account. That's why, as Thomas Mulcair says, as Yves-François Blanchet once said, it is in fact a trap to go along with this. And again, what was interesting too is that the CSIS Act, I just was alerted to this morning in a Globe and Mail piece. The CSIS Act actually gives CSIS the opportunity to go to the leader of a party and say, yeah, you should be aware of this thing that affects your party. So they won't tell Poilievre about a Liberal MP. They won't tell him about a New Democrat. But if there was a Conservative MP or a Conservative candidate, CSIS could go to him and tell him what their concerns were. The Conservatives say that has not happened. They have received no such briefing, no such alert from CSIS. Now, CSIS may be fumbling the ball. This has happened on a couple of occasions, but it could also be that these are not issues that are in the Conservative caucus. These are issues that are in the Liberal caucus, the only caucus which, by the way, the leader has not come out and denied having any members of Parliament implicated. So take from that what you will, but you should pay attention to Trudeau's refusal to even answer the question. And you may think that they want to apply this whole national security thing to anything that makes them look bad, including the government's own carbon tax projections. They fought tooth and nail to keep these from being published. They told the parliamentary budget officer, yeah, you can look at them, but don't you dare talk about them. So they put a gag on him. And Kris Sims and her colleagues at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation have figured out exactly why that is. Kris, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having us on.
Now, again, the Liberals may want it, but it's not a national security secret. We can talk about these figures that we have seen. What do the numbers tell us?
It's pretty brutal, Andrew, and it's no wonder really why now it turns out the Trudeau government didn't want the parliamentary budget officer reporting this number. So if I can just rewind the tape back to when everybody understood from the parliamentary budget office where they had come up with two different scenarios. One was just the base cost, okay, of Monica filling up her little Honda Civic hatchback, how much that cost her. Translation, that was around $6 or $7. Oh, look, 8 out of 10 people get more back in rebates than they pay out. The problem there was, of course, the PBO did his homework and they had a secondary calculation which talked about the economic impact of the Trudeau government's carbon tax. So that means, of course, how much the farmer is paying to grow the food with the carbon tax, how much the trucker is paying to fill up the big rig to bring you the food, how much you pay for home heating. You get the idea. And there, that just blew it out of the water. There, I think it was over $900 per year per Alberta household with rebates factored in. Fast forward to very recently, the parliamentary budget officer had said, you know what, I've gone back and I've done some new calculations. And then all of a sudden, the Trudeau government was like, shh, like, stop talking about it. And so that was super weird, right? And that, of course, got everybody interested, including the opposition, saying, cough up the data. Well, very late last week, cough up the data they did. Now, we don't have the breakdown of per person yet, or per province yet, but we're working on it. We've got a team of folks who are working on this in Ottawa right now. So big picture, Andrew, it looks like in the year 2030, the carbon tax is going to cost the Canadian economy around $25 billion. Now, that's just in that 1 year. I need to stress that. That is not the cumulative cost of the carbon tax between now and 2030. That's just for the singular year. Now, the data sheets and the spreadsheets we have here are mind-boggling. You know, when you open up an Excel spreadsheet and you've got that little slider on the right where you can move stuff up and down, there's so many rows of data in just one of these tables that little slider is like the size of a peppercorn. Like, I can't even remember how many rows of data are in these models. So it's pretty crazy. But big shot is that it's around 25 billion by 2030. So it's no wonder they wanted to keep it under wraps.
Yeah, but again, so costing the economy that this is the carbon tax that we're told is quote unquote revenue neutral, right?
Yes.
So it's weird that it can be revenue neutral yet somehow have a $25 billion annual cost to the economy. How do we get there?
Yeah, exactly. Just add government. That's how you get there. They can just take whatever they want and try to spin a narrative out of it. And in all seriousness, this is where the math just never holds up. And just bringing people back to the original cause of the carbon tax here in North America, in 2008, the BC Liberal government brought in what they called and promised was going to be a revenue neutral carbon tax. That was under then Premier Gordon Campbell. Now, to be fair, on paper, initially, one could argue that it was revenue neutral because back then it was about 3 or 4 cents per liter. And they also put forward a corresponding income tax cut right across the board. So the nerds in universities and economics classes could say, yeah, on paper, this is revenue neutral. But the problem there is it doesn't factor in the nature of government and the nature of people, right? Because government, of course, is people. And if they can find a revenue stream, i.e. a vampiric tax they can sink their fangs deeper into, that's exactly what they're going to do, Andrew. So after a couple of years in BC, what did they start doing? They took in, say, $1 billion, for argument's sake, for the carbon tax. And then to make it look revenue neutral in the budget, that's where they just started filing all their random tax credits for everything. Like old people tax credits, fitness gym. So when you're going to the gym and pulling your hamstrings, you got a fitness tax credit for that. So this is what government does. And now we have the Trudeau government saying something silly like you get more back than you pay in. Well, this shows that is obviously not true.
Yeah, the same isn't true for the Canadian economy. The same isn't true for the country.
This is it. And for people watching your show know the deal. But when you're talking to your uncle or your sister-in-law or somebody who still doesn't quite get it, they can say things like, oh, well, that's just the economic cost. Who cares about that? Okay. The economy is not some alien force that does not affect your day-to-day life. Everything you do, when you're filling up your car, when you're purchasing food that was grown, when you're thinking of buying a house, when you're fixing your vehicle, all that stuff, that's all the economy. It's working around you like the force, okay? If you tax that thing and you blow a $25 billion hole in the side of its hull, you're going to have some troubled waters.
Well, and I always want to take the bigger picture on this because the carbon tax is based on a number of premises. It's based on the premise that man-made global warming is caused by the emissions that are regulated by the carbon tax. It's predicated on the fact that the carbon tax will result in the reduction of those emissions. It's predicated on the idea that even if Canada were to reduce its emissions, that will cause a global reduction. And one of the arguments Michael Binion from the Modern Miracle Network has made is that you could make Canada's emissions go up and lower global emissions because we are more efficient with our energy production than other countries are. So that's one argument that's put forward. But you bring this up all the time, and I think it's important. We have about 1.5% of global emissions that are Canada's responsibility. And no carbon tax proposal, no environmental proposal in Canada has proposed getting that even down to 1%, say. And
That's
even if
correct.
it did, that would be a drop in the bucket globally.
Thank you. And I think this is worth pointing out because you and I, we can sit here and bang our heads against the wall about the carbon tax quite a bit. But every now and then, I think it's important to reach across the aisle and try to meet people where they are. So let's say, for argument's sake, okay, that your key issue is global emissions, okay? Keeps you up at night, gets you out of bed in the morning. It's the reason why you've gone to university, to pursue a trade or whatever it is that's a calling for you. Okay, let's meet them there, okay? It still doesn't work. This equation still doesn't work because, as you point out, Canada is responsible for about 1.5% of global emissions, okay? We also have a gigantic honking boreal forest that a lot of scientists keep trying to gently point out, but few people seem to understand or talk about. So, okay, let's set that aside. Look at the math. Look at just the emissions. Even if Canada ceased to exist tomorrow, God forbid, and we stopped heating and eating and growing our food and driving to work, it wouldn't make a dent in global emissions. So for the folks who are truly gripped with this fear that we're all going to boil the planet in the next 18 months or so, and that Canada is responsible, and that using a carbon tax will reduce that, that doesn't even make sense to meet them with their own math, Andrew. So then why not look at the big end of the arithmetic problem and say, okay, where is there a global democracy with a big population that has a really heavy emissions output right now? India. Okay, we've worked with India quite a bit. They used to be a Commonwealth country. There's a lot of interchange there. What if we sold them our natural gas instead of them burning wood and animal dung every single day? Guess what? The government of India is begging us to sell them natural gas from Canada. So that would reduce global emissions. That column in that graph would go down. And we wouldn't need a carbon tax here in Canada, which is doing absolutely nothing, by the way, here in Canada. We're still getting increasing emissions in Canada. The government's own data between 2023 and 2024 shows an increase in federal emissions in Canada, even though we have a carbon tax. This lines up perfectly with BC.
Well, and that brings us, the other premise, or one of the other premises, is that the emitting activities are discretionary, which is, in the case of rural Canadians, absolutely wrong. I'll give an example of this. So I live in southwestern Ontario. So when I drive to Toronto, which I try to avoid, but I've had to a few times as of late, you go on the 401 and there's a lane carved out at several points for carpooling or electric vehicles, the high occupancy vehicle lane. And you look in this, and oftentimes it's empty. And the reason, when you see people in it that have two or more people in their cars, I'm not convinced a single one of them has chosen to carpool to use the lane. They are people who happen to have an extra person in the car and say, oh, great, I can use the carpool lane today. But it's not actually incentivizing behavior. It's just ultimately penalizing everyone else on the road. And I think the same is true of the carbon tax, where very few people are choosing to live differently because driving their kids, driving to work, these things for a lot of people are not choices. These are now things that are simply penalized when you have to heat your home or fill up your tank.
Yes, exactly. And so any way you look at this argument, these folks in the Guilbeault mentality, in Minister Stéphane Guilbeault's mentality, who are really zealous about this sort of stuff, they're always lost for an answer. Because any way you come at them with the cost of the carbon tax, shows you the data is actually costing people big time money. With the emissions, once again, here in Canada, emissions are going up anyway, and we're not the ones that are contributing to the big time global emissions. So why don't we focus on that instead? And bingo, exactly this. So I wanted to quickly talk about this. Okay, so when the carbon tax was first hatched in North America, again, going back to BC, and Trudeau used British Columbia as a model. That's why I keep going back to it, because it's a template, okay? Government is just like high school. You get in with the cool crowd and you're a follower. So this is what they're doing, okay?
So I was never getting in with the cool crowd. You'll have to come up with a better explanation.
Me neither, but here we are. I was a drama kid. So take a look there, right? And so what they were also promising is that with this big shiny new carbon tax that was revenue neutral when there's a chicken in every pot, is that it would create an abundance of affordable accessible, abundant, consistent alternative energy. Okay, that people would be able to switch. Okay, it's like switching between a plastic bag and a little nylon bag that you brought from home. It's annoying, sure, but that's kind of a switch, right? There's no switch for the vast majority of people to make in Canada. Yes, there are those hardcore people who manage to live with a pedal bike and a solar panel on their roof. We're talking about the vast majority of folks. They don't have a way of switching their energy source, and it's been since 2008. So the government's solution to all of this has been no solution. It's simply become now a financial punishment for heating your home, driving to work, and feeding your kids. People are backed into a corner, and the government keeps hitting them with this carbon tax, which is a punishment. And the Liberal government, by the way, used the term punishment in an interview. So now we're at this weird crossroads where they're trying to move the goalposts, Andrew, and talk more about wealth redistribution and being fairer to poorer people and taking away from middle class and working class people and handing it to the folks who could never afford a car in the beginning. They didn't talk like this when they first launched the carbon tax. When they first launched the carbon tax, they said it was going to be revenue neutral, that it reduce emissions, and it would create a whole bunch of alternative energies that everybody could use. None of those things has happened.
Very well said. I know you'll keep on this, Kris. We'll perhaps get an update from you next week. Kris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Our Monday tax fighter, Kris Sims. Always good to check in with her. We are packing a lot into the show today, but bear with me. We're going to move right on here because this is a fascinating one. And I actually had a conversation about this with someone the other day. We were talking about this idea of wokeness, which is, I think, increasingly become only a term used by people who are criticizing wokeness. But the idea itself is one that's certainly championed by a number of institutions, incredibly by governments, by academic institutions, and many others. And the problem with it is that it is ingrained in it is this idea of identity politics and pitting groups against each other. We start to define people by their group identity rather than by their individual identity. And when you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, you see they're trying to solve one problem and are ignoring, or in some cases, creating another. Our friends over at the Aristotle Foundation did what I found to be a fascinating study looking at poverty and race in Canada, and they found that most of the poor in Canada are white. So how are these people being helped by so many of the pro-inclusivity measures? The fact remains they really aren't. This study was done by Matthew Lau and David Hunt, the latter of whom is the research director for the Aristotle Foundation and joins us now. David, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today. You are muted there. I don't know if you can unmute on your end or if it's something Sean will have to do. I'm not hearing you. All right, we'll get that sorted out in just a moment here and bring David Hunt back in when it's resolved. But the study is called Poverty and Race in Canada, Facts About Race Discrimination and the Poor. Sorry, Sean, you say it looks normal. Are you saying that like you hear him and it's just me, or... Oh, no, he doesn't hear him either. Okay. We'll get that sorted out and we'll have David back on. But the piece is called Poverty and Race in Canada, Facts About Race Discrimination and the Poor. Since I have a moment here, let me just share on an unrelated subject, this poll that I found interesting. So you may have seen on the weekend, Abacus had a poll that came out, showed the Conservatives with a 20-point lead over the Liberals. But also in that poll, interestingly enough, was that Canadians are looking at immigration as being a top 5 issue, which it hasn't been certainly in recent memory. Immigration is now more motivating to voters than climate change. So that's a fascinating point that we'll probably delve into a bit more tomorrow. But I believe I heard in my ear David Hunt is with us. David, good to have you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andrew.
So let me ask you first and foremost about why you decided to look into this, because race is obviously a bit of a landmine issue, especially when your thesis is, as it ultimately came out to be, that we have this problem facing white Canadians that's not really being explored.
Hey, thanks for that question, Andrew. I think actually this is in part why the Aristotle Foundation exists. Is as you said, this is a topic that perhaps others don't want to cover. And I think we're a brand new think tank, and there are issues we need to talk about because they They impact everyday Canadians. And in the case of this study, it's impacting the most disadvantaged Canadians. And it's a topic that others don't want to talk about, but we got to talk about it. And the reality is, hey, who actually are the poor in Canada? And why do we have funding in this country that is based on the color of your skin? And that, in this case, leaves out the overwhelming majority of those who are poor in Canada.
So we have different programs. I mean, there are anti-racism initiatives, there are anti-Islamophobia initiatives, anti-Semitism initiatives, there are anti-poverty initiatives. Are the anti-poverty initiatives specifically targeting diverse groups instead of the poor whites that you're talking about?
Yeah, no, there will be programs that are available to many, but there are the fact that there are any, and frankly, there are a number of programs that are under the guise of anti-poverty reduction, but whether or not you qualify is not based on a financial criterion or criteria. It's based on the color of your skin. Do you fall under one of the minority categories, or in some cases, it's very specific, where it's for perhaps Indigenous only, or for that matter, Black only funding. This study, frankly, we should probably do a follow-up study where we actually go through and identify like what are all the programs. That was beyond the scope of the study. What we were looking at here was simply, okay, here's the Statistics Canada data of who is poor in Canada. And the fact that so many are being left out. Why, frankly, is there any programming that is judging people based on the color of their skin and providing poverty relief based on skin color? We think that's illiberal and frankly, un-Canadian.
Look, if you looked at raw numbers, Canada is a 70% white country. So if every group was affected by poverty equally, you'd have more impoverished white Canadians than minority Canadians. How is it proportionally, though? Are minority communities more disproportionately affected by poverty? Is that how the government justifies this imbalance?
I would assume so, because yes, like let's be real. Both, especially let's take two groups: Indigenous Canadians and Black Canadians. They are more likely to be in poverty, and that is an issue. But what's the root cause? What's the reason for that? Is race the reason why they're in poverty? And we would argue, just by looking at the data, we would say no, race is not the primary factor. Another study that we did back in October with Matthew Lau looks at income in the country. And when it comes to income, white Canadians are actually not even in the middle. There are many different ethnic groups, or what Statistics Canada calls cohorts. There are many that make more income than white Canadians. And what's interesting is when you control for education, for example, just one of many things you can control for, and just compare your Indigenous Canadians with non-Indigenous Canadians. Once education is plugged in, there's almost no differences in some areas. Like, for example, if you have a medical degree and you're Indigenous, you're going to be making more money on average than those who are not Indigenous. Same as if you have a PhD or a master's. So the causes of poverty, at least in Canada, are not based on race. Where do you live? Are you living in a metropolitan area, or do you live out in the country? That's going to affect whether or not you're in poverty and your income. Again, what's your level of education? Are you religious or not religious? There's so many different factors. What we're saying here is, even though, yes, there are particular groups that may be disproportionately in poverty, race is not the cause for that. So if we're going to solve these problems, let's not be allocating resources based on race, because we're not going to get to the root issue.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, the left uses the term intersectionality to talk about, the way that if you're a Black trans Indigenous person in a wheelchair, your experience is going to be different than if you're just a Black woman who's able-bodied and all of this. And I think there's truth to that. I mean, life is full of disadvantages and advantages, and no person has, few people have, the best optimal thing in every way of their life. I'm a white male, but I'm also overweight. And, like, for example, so it's stuff like that. And I think that what's interesting is that they don't actually look at all of these different categories and all of these different groups. One area that's often missing is urban-rural, which, as you mentioned, is hugely, hugely influential. And I think even Indigenous. If you were to take the where they live in the country factor into that. I think you'd see a lot of variety within Indigenous populations, and also education level, as you mentioned, is key as well. I mean, if you're to use the old like show that people of my age are familiar with, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Well, that experience of that black family in Beverly Hills, in Bel-Air, is going to be a heck of a lot different than some rural white working class family from northern Alberta, say.
And that's why it's critical we have these conversations. And although this study is particularly provocative, right, because we're saying, hey, there's more white people in poverty than every other ethnicity combined, but to open up this proverbial can of worms, to have these conversations in terms of, hey, if we're seeing Canadians that are falling behind, that are disadvantaged, well, of course, we want to do something about that, and that's right. But let's get at the root. So towards the end of this short study, we point to what's called the success sequence. And this was not introduced, but popularized by the Brookings Institution down in the States. And they're by no means a conservative think tank. But they popularized this concept, and what they found is in the United States, roughly 97% of Americans who finish high school, get a full-time job, get married, have kids, do it in that order, 97%, by the time they get to their 30s, they're not going to experience poverty. And poverty defined in the absolute sense, lacking the bare necessities of life. So that study was then replicated by scholars at the University of Virginia only a few years ago, looking at millennials, so our age cohort, and same thing. They replicated the study, found 97% of millennials that finished high school, then got a full-time job, then got married, had kids, did it in that order. 97% in their 30s are not in poverty. So that was then replicated in Canada. And Christopher Sarlo with the Fraser Institute replicated the study in Canada just a few years ago and found it's not 97% in Canada. It's over 99% that follow the success sequence are not in absolute poverty as adults. So is everyone going to get married? No. Is everyone going to finish high school? No. Is everyone going to have a full-time job? No. But what the big takeaway there is there's certain cultural norms that are tried and true, frankly, over the centuries. And if we put these things into practice, and from a policy perspective, if we make it easier for more people to get on that yellow brick road, so to speak, to get on that success sequence, we're going to alleviate much of the worst effects of poverty. And frankly, there'll be much fewer people in Canada in poverty if we follow things like the success sequence and whatever those norms are that feed into that.
Well, we had an op-ed from you over at True North about this, and people can read the study for themselves at the Aristotle Foundation's website, aristotlefoundation.org. David Hunt, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, thank you, Andrew.
All right, that does it for us for this afternoon. We will be back tomorrow in just, 23 hours and 15 minutes with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. Let us know what you think about this in the comments wherever you are watching, and we will talk to you next time. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.